BPD. You've probably heard the term, maybe even the stereotypes, but what is it really? Why is it considered the most painful mental disorder? And why does it remain so misunderstood? I'm going to break it all down, what BPD is, the symptoms, what causes it, and my experience plus my own journey to recovery. Even if BPD doesn't apply to you, I hope this gives you insight. And hey, I'm Nico, by the way. I was diagnosed 5 years ago, at 19, so I know quite a bit. Now, I'm no medical professional, so this is just informative from the perspective of a former psych patient. Anyways, enjoy. It's a long video. Feel free to skip around. I'll leave it up on screen now. Now back to the video. So what the hell even is BPD? Now, borderline personality disorder is often described as the mental illness that brings the most amount of psychological pain. One of its core struggles, emotional regulation, or rather, the inability to regulate emotions. Imagine feeling everything on a much wider spectrum. Happiness isn't just happiness, it's euphoria. Sadness is not just sadness. It's devastation, and once an emotion hits, it lasts longer and takes longer to settle. And it's like living with a brain that experiences emotions at full volume all the goddamn time. That's what makes BPD so intense, and that intensity can make reactions seem extreme to the outside world, but from the inside, it's just how we experience emotions. That disconnect between how we feel and how people perceive it, that's where a lot of the misunderstandings come from to begin with. See, the definition of a personality disorder is as follows. A condition characterized by enduring maladaptive patterns of behavior, cognition, and inner experience, deviating from those accepted by culture. Which brings me to why BPD is so stigmatized. Now, BPD falls under cluster B, the so-called dramatic ones. And thanks to media portrayals, it's often demonized. We're painted in a way as if we're broken beyond repair, but that's not reality. And here's the good news, BPD isn't permanent. With the right treatment and with the right effort, you can go into remission, meaning you no longer meet the criteria for BPD. Recovery is possible, change is possible, and I know it because I've been through it. I've put in the work, I've put in the effort, and I'm slowly but surely on the other side of it. If you know someone with BPD, their reactions might seem confusing, even overwhelming, but there is somewhat of a pattern to it. The diagnostic manual lists 9 criteria. So to understand BPD, we can take a look at the 9 symptoms. So I'll dive into them one by one and speaking about my own experience and where I'm at now with them. First one being extreme mood swings. These powerful emotions, they're not only just powerful, they also swing like a pendulum. Now, these mood swings can last from anywhere between a few minutes to hours. Oftentimes, they just happen so quickly. For example, me, when I was at my worst, this was absolutely what I was most exhausted by. For example, I could be the happiest person in the room and not 5 minutes later be the complete opposite of that, especially if the symptoms go unmanaged. I think mood swings especially lead to some of the other maladaptive behavior in the first place. Imagine not being able to regulate these powerful swings. You wouldn't exactly behave rationally, would you? And that's where a lot of the other symptoms come in simply. For me, just off the top of my head, I can remember so many times where I would be in that swing, I would be in that pendulum and hit the bottom. And some of the things I would do would be exactly because of that. Self-harm, I want to get into that too, but for example, if the only coping mechanisms you have are inherently self-harming or negative in any way, especially because oftentimes I found my normal coping mechanisms to not be adequate when being at the lowest of lows, and so that would lead to exactly an increase in my other symptoms. Now with these mood swings, I take medication. I take something called Lamictal. It's a prescription medicine for people with epilepsy, but it so happens that it also regulates emotions. Imagine that medication taking those 5% off the top and 5% off the bottom. The impact that has is incredibly astounding. I have more energy left over due to that to regulate those other 90%, which, to be honest, is still a wider range of emotions than most people. But when you're used to 100% and you only have to regulate 90, you're kind of fit for the task almost in a way. So mood swings for me are not what I spend my time on the most anymore. So now mood swings are no longer as impactful in my day-to-day as they used to be. I simply have more energy left over because of medication. There's also coping strategies that I've used to overcome the swings, as they still happen a lot, but not to a degree where it impacts my life enough to be a nuisance. It's more so just something I have to deal with, and I'm perfectly okay with that. I will say DBT has been tremendous in giving me these skills to regulate my emotions. So medication, DBT, perfect combo for exactly this symptom. And that's just been how I dealt with that and how I still deal with it. On the topic of emotions, another criteria is chronic feelings of emptiness. Imagine feeling completely emotionally hollow, even when things are not necessarily bad, but it's hard to describe. Like, I can say this, but the experience of it is, it's kind of terrifying at times. It's very much so an emptiness that impacts every single aspect of your life. And when you're in that state, so to speak, when you're dealing with that, it can be very difficult to get what you need done. But also just like the experience of that, having an entire day where you don't feel anything but empty. For me especially, when I was early on in my journey, I would try anything to get myself out of it. Anything to get out of that void. Whether it be substances, reckless behavior, whatever it could be, any risk I could take that could kind of get me up on a high. Because at the point where you feel that emptiness, it's almost as if anything is worth doing just so you can get out of it. That's how difficult it is to have that type of emptiness. It completely takes so much away from your life, and this is something I still deal with. Not so often. I think a lot has to do with my life being way more stable than it has been. The work I've put in, things like that, and it just sucks to all of the people that have this and experience this. Leave your tips in the comments, like, and if you think of the dichotomy of feeling too much but also having chronic feelings of emptiness, it's quite astounding how you can swing so much and yet end up at a place where you feel nothing. But that's BPD, you know. The next symptom is intense anger. Frequent, intense anger, difficulty controlling it, and sometimes explosive outbursts or physical aggression is how that's described in the DSM. Personally, this symptom is something I experienced to a large degree, and I want to say kind of, because I would never externalize it. I would always internalize that anger if I fucked up, or if someone was mad at me, or whatever would provoke that anger. I would always take it out on myself. For a period, that was what led me to anorexia. The life you've lived when you have BPD, I will confidently say you have all the reason in the world to be angry, if anything, but that does not mean you have to take it out on people. Growing up in a household where I was the recipient of that, I think early on I just decided I would never put anyone in that position that I was put in so frequently. So I feel that anger still sometimes, that intense, overwhelming fury. But I've figured out a way to use it for good. For example, if I'm really mad, it makes the best runs, and I don't want to joke about it, but you can transmutate that anger into something great. I think that goes for a lot of the emotions you experience with BPD. You can kind of use them in a different context, and they might even be beneficial. Now, physical aggression is a part of the criteria, but I've never been violent, for example. And I think that kind of goes to show how different the experience of these symptoms can be. There's a very different outcome of someone externalizing a symptom or internalizing it. And I want to make that a point too. If you're around someone that externalizes all their suffering all the time. That's just not healthy, you know? It really is not. And so yeah, anger is fury. This brings me to the next criteria, which is impulsivity. It's not just being impulsive, it's being impulsive to a degree where you're engaging in reckless behavior. Things like excessive spending, substance abuse, binge eating, reckless driving, whatever it might be. I want to make a point about this. A lot of these symptoms are not just what they appear, it's the severity of it. You might be thinking, oh, this sounds like this person I know, but they might not even meet the criteria even though they're displaying these traits. They have to meet a certain severity to count almost. This is one of these symptoms that I still deal with, but it's one of the last remaining. I can look back at so many times where my impulsivity was off the charts. This oftentimes led to substance abuse. Before quitting this time, for example, I might have been on a sober streak. Something stressful would come up or something I couldn't exactly deal with. But man, like, I experienced this impulsivity to the degree where all rationality would just go out the window completely. There was a time where I went on a trip on a whim. So in the middle of a semester in college when I was studying finance, I just disappeared for 2 weeks and went to America. And now America is like completely on the opposite side of the pond for me. I'm a European, right? And while I had great experiences over there, the reason for that trip to begin with was exactly because of this. And to turn a bit dark, I want to go into self-harm too. Now this is not easy for me to speak about, but I will try my best, and please seek help if you need it. You can skip this part if it gets too difficult to listen to as well. The next criteria, which is self-harm or suicidal behavior. Oftentimes I would be at such a shitty emotional place. For me, self-harm was always a way to control my emotions, and it's a terrible way to have to cope. And for anyone having to deal with this currently, I feel sorry. It sucks. It's terrible to be in a place where it seems like the only option. And if you have thoughts of harming yourself, please call someone, talk to someone. This is incredibly harsh to experience all the time. And if you're looking for help, there simply are so many different ways to get your emotions out. Like, I will say I've been on the other side of a suicide, and man, don't underestimate the void you'll leave. It can't be described. I have this one person especially I still hold so dear in my heart, but if things could have been different, I would have been living a completely different life. Please call the hotline if you're thinking about harming yourself. I don't want to give advice on what you need to do. I'm not a medical professional, so call someone, talk to them, and they'll help you in the way they can, okay? And if you think it's not enough, if you think you're completely stuck, seek help anyways. Things might just suck right now, and you'll be happy you didn't take your life. Because I'm certainly happy I'm still alive and I've built a life worth living. And you can definitely do that too. I will say to those struggling with exactly this aspect, there are numerous great ways to cope. And even if you don't have therapy available to you right now, there's a DBT workbook. I'll list what it's called and you can just search on Google. I don't know how to transition from this. I'm sorry guys, but I'll just talk about the next one. This was kind of very, very difficult for me to speak about too. Fuck. I'm getting so emotional right now and it's difficult to be in, but I'm trying to sit with it. Okay. I'll tackle the next one now. As you can imagine, something like this, all these symptoms up to this point already, will lead to the next criteria, which is unstable relationships. As you can imagine, having to deal with these symptoms while maintaining healthy relationships are incredibly difficult. That's why you see so many stigmatized BPD to begin with. They've had one bad experience with someone, and I'm not gonna say you can't hold people accountable, but I will say having this disorder, you're in so much mental agony all the time. Imagine having to live a normal life with expectations of a normal person when you're too mentally unwell. And obviously this will lead to unstable relationships if you're not dealing with your symptoms. And oftentimes if you're diagnosed with BPD, you haven't learned the necessary skills to even deal with something as difficult as this. I sure as shit did not. I had such an unstable home to begin with, so my foundation of what was healthy was completely skewed. This is why you hear horror stories like crazy ex-girlfriend, all this bullshit. Oftentimes, I will say from my own experience, if a friendship has ended, it's not like it's entirely on me. Just because I have BPD. That wouldn't be fair. You know, sometimes people just act shitty and things have to come to an end. And to get back on track with unstable relationships, they might swing from idealization to devaluation. Like there might be black and white thinking to some degree with this symptom. I know from my own personal experience that when I've been increasingly mentally unwell, I've had to pull back from friendships and relationships, and this hasn't affected my life too much, but I can definitely see why it affects so many people. Having to pull back from people you hold close because you are too mentally unwell will oftentimes lead to people not understanding why. Of course, how can people understand when you pull away for your own sake? And so if you are increasingly swinging from being well to being mentally unwell all the fucking time, there will be this swing in relationships. This doesn't have to be a bad thing. Sometimes it can be a good thing. But those of you who have someone close to you that have BPD, if you can help them kind of manage that swing just a tiny bit, it goes so far. For example, me and my partner, the way we've maintained a healthy and great relationship, I can't believe how phenomenal it is. It's simply because I'm able to be open and raw about where I'm currently at mentally, and she does not take that personally. If I'm having a really shitty day and I know I need time for myself in a way that might seem like a bit much, she understands. She gives me that space to be myself, and so having space to deal with it for me is absolutely necessary. Even for you, for example, for you it might be a bit different. It might be that, okay, this person pulls away and all you want to do is help them. That doesn't necessarily mean that they need your help at this current time. You have to talk to them about how you want to handle this. When things are a bit rocky, what are your plans? Do you have a crisis plan, for example? Do you have a way of letting them know that you still care about them, even if things aren't exactly the easiest? Because it makes all the difference in the world. It truly does. I cannot fathom how different my relationships have been since going through therapy and having the experience of being able to master like some of these symptoms. Without doubt, that work has kind of led me down a road where I can maintain healthy relationships in all aspects. Friendships, relationships, like both of those, in a way I couldn't before because my symptoms were just too much and too much for some people to handle, to see. So when you've had this experience of it becoming too much for people and them withdrawing, and this leads into something called fear of abandonment, which is one of the last criteria. I know it's been a long video, so thank you for letting me explain this to you. See, when you've had enough experiences of people kind of leaving you on a whim, this could be early in your life or whenever, you build this fear of people abandoning you over and over and over again. And when this was at its worst for me, it didn't matter how great a friendship, a relationship was. I would simply feel afraid that they would leave at any given time. And to live with something like that it's very difficult. And I will say this could lead to self-sabotage even. That is one aspect I've been great at not letting spill out. If I can say that, like, if I feel this fear, it's not often anymore, luckily. I've built the right relationships. I'm around the right people, simply. But when I feel that fear of this being the end of a friendship, even if there's no sign of it, I keep it to myself. I keep it inside. I sit with it. And now, if we look at the description of this symptom, intense fear of being left alone or rejected, leading to frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, real or imagined. That part about it being imagined, it's like you're trying to fix something that isn't broken. And so oftentimes you end up pushing people away. That was the case for me, at least. And that's why my experience has been that if you can keep that fear inside of yourself and not do anything different, you will have a different experience. As a whole, this stemmed from having an incredibly unstable home life. I never knew if I could rely on the people I needed to be able to rely on, right? My dad wasn't in the picture. My mom would be emotionally absent, physically absent. And it was like drawing the lottery of if that person could be there for me. So this abandonment over and over and over again like created a wound simply in me that led to this fear of being abandoned again, because it's painful as fuck. And you might have experienced this too, like whatever it may be, a friend ending a friendship out of the blue, that wound, imagine having that out of the womb, so to speak. Like, it's incredibly painful, this aspect. If the person you know are dealing with this, man, talk to them. I think I'll take a step back from this symptom. I might delve back into it, but I think that's what I wanted to say about that. The last one, I still experience this one. It's the one that drags me down the most. I got it here. So, transient dissociative symptoms or psychotic-like features in situations of high stress. This is also listed as transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. For me, this comes up as episodes of derealization during high stress periods. This might differ from what people typically experience, but it's simply like losing touch with reality. Like, it's like I physically feel myself stepping into a different world where everything around me seems off in a way. Seems like it's no longer the same, foreign in a way, you could say. And with that, it gives me the feeling of an environment around me being completely emotionally drained, almost. It's very difficult to describe. My apartment, for example, would feel like it's not mine. My friends would not feel like they're real. My friends would not feel like they're my friends. Or it's like you remember who they are, but it doesn't, you have no emotional connection to them. That's how I experienced this one. It's very difficult to explain, but this one is heavily dependent on the person experiencing it, I would say. So I can't exactly give much information about this one. This will very much so be a research it and talk to the person if you're related to someone with PPD. But yeah, man, I remember one time, this had to do with finances. The video I made recently, essentially I went over a story from my life where my entire financial well-being was contingent on a counselor. And so I got pretty fucking paranoid about having my livelihood ripped away from me. And during those, it was like this combination of paranoia, but also like detachment of reality for my mind to cope with something as difficult as that. That shit was just terrible. So go watch my video if you want to hear about that, but I'll keep it at that for this time. Damn, I almost skipped over one of the symptoms that I still struggle with, which is identity disturbance, also called unstable sense of self, described as markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. I feel like this is very dependent on the person too, but overall, with the people I've known that have BPD, it's almost as if we don't know who we are. It's like we have a vision of ourselves that is just not solid in any way, and I think for me, that definitely came from being told who I was growing up, and so it was almost always tied to somebody else telling me who I was, and that is not really a good way to know who you are, you know? So I cut off my mom, for example. She definitely made me have certain beliefs about myself that just are not in any way true, and I remember when I cut her off, it was almost as if I was kind of killing a part of myself. Like this image that had been upheld for so many years, all the way up until I was 22, was all of a sudden, you know, just not there. There was no one to upkeep it, like there had been. And so I was confronted with that. And slowly I'm learning who I am, but I think I have a long ways to go with that aspect, definitely. Which means, like, oftentimes I'll accomplish so many things, and it's almost as if my brain doesn't, like, correlate that with me. And I know you're not your accomplishments, but like the qualities you have to accomplish certain things, I feel like my brain doesn't recognize that I have. I know that I have a lot of grit, but it still feels like I don't, in a sense. For example, like I renovated a kitchen last year that took an incredible amount of grit, so much persistence, consistency with carrying out the solutions to problems that were not foreseen, and I had to pick up so much. I've kind of dealt with it by building something called self-efficacy. It's not something like building a stable sense of self at all. It's building the belief that you can attain a goal you set out for yourself. I want to make a complete video on that. I might have mentioned that a couple of times, but the identity part, I feel like it's almost as if the identity part of me is always shifting. With that comes like uncertainty, obviously, and it doesn't matter how much people tell me who I am at this point. It's like I've shut that valve completely off. So I'm kind of completely relying on myself to know who I am, and it's not like that is working out as it would normally, not in any way whatsoever. And even though I know I have certain things that I like about myself and I can clearly see, it feels like they're just different aspects that are not correlated in any way, shape or form, but more so just like baseball cards or something like that. It's weird. And I think the reason I'm having such difficulty even explaining it is because I don't really know where I have to go to confront this symptom. See, I didn't have time in therapy to deal with this. It being in the public system, like the public healthcare system, you only had a limited amount of sessions, and getting those extended was not really a possibility at the time for me, meaning certain aspects were just more important than others. So yeah, short segment, but if you have any addition to this, leave it in a comment. I would love to learn more about this aspect, and I'm currently delving into research on it, but I don't feel like I can give like a complete opinion about it just yet, you know what I mean? I just want to quickly go over what causes BPD. It's not super simple. It's still debated a lot, but the main points are trauma growing up and genetics. So you might be predisposed to BPD, but not end up having it. And so you can have a lot of trauma, but not end up having BPD. It's not like there's a direct correlation between these two aspects, but do your own research on this topic. But I will say most people with BPD have had incredibly difficult lives. From the people I've talked to, from the people I know, there's almost always a incredibly difficult story behind their lives, and yeah, it sucks, but you know, it's our responsibility to handle that. And so with that, I just want to say thank you for listening. This has definitely been the hardest video for me to make, especially because it's so personal to me. So many aspects I had to kind of open up about, and it's not something I've done since I've left therapy in this way, which is taxing. It's taxing on my mental health, to be honest. But I feel so much better having explained this as I understand it, you know. Just some final words. I will say BPD can definitely be treated. It's possible to succeed in therapy too. And I know for those of you listening who have BPD, how difficult things are, especially if you can't get treatment. So definitely look into the BPD workbook by Matthew McKay, I believe. It gives you a framework to do it on your own, and I think that's especially helpful. And it might seem daunting at first, but I just took some chapters at a time and really applied myself, really took that as a studying opportunity to learn about myself, to learn about how to overcome this incredibly difficult mental illness that BPD is. And yeah, I really appreciate you watching. If you have additions, if there's any critique, leave it in a comment, okay? Like, I'm not perfect, and I'm just a psych patient who overcame my own struggles. They might not be directly comparable to yours, but I hope you've taken something away, at least. And that's all I have to say on this topic for right now. Yeah, some aspects are fucking difficult. Show yourself some compassion, because I know how difficult it is. I know how alone you can feel in this illness, because it's only 1 in 100 that's diagnosed, or 2% or something like that. Especially men with BPD, that's not something you see often. But yeah, that's about it. I want to wrap this video up, and hey, I appreciate you, and keep crushing it, man. It is attainable, and it might not come easy for us, but the cards we're dealt with is what we have to face. It's not our fault that we've confronted so much trauma in our lifetime, but it is our responsibility. And I want to say that from the bottom of my heart. We have the responsibility of our own illness. That is really key. So take full accountability. Look up radical acceptance, because that helps a lot. And yeah,